Yay. There we
Got
go.
it.
Okay. Now that I got that figured out, let's talk about something. Today's question is, how might I apply what I learn in this class to my life? So I'm glad that both of you have been to other classes before because this is probably not a class to start and join, for your first night.
Probably not.
Anybody out there who is joining us for the very first time, I apologize, but maybe now you'll know what to do when you go back and listen to the other classes. So, as usual, we start with our assumptions. Um, so, I want to start with the question, why do we care about applying what we learn? Is that something, why is that something that is valuable to us? And then, in fact, as I was thinking about this, I thought, no, I want to go back even further. Not even just why do we care about applying learning, but why do we learn in the first place? What is the point of learning? And the first place I went, actually, interestingly, about this was Ecclesiastes, to our pessimistic slash realistic friend. The writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to figure out the meaning of life, trying to figure out what all this suffering, if anything, is for. So this is Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. The writer says, I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see all is vanity and a chasing after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a chasing after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. So not a very good happy message there. The idea that chasing after knowledge and wisdom are vanity, are all in vain. But it gets worse. Then the writer says in chapter 2, I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to those who come after me, and who knows whether they will be wise or foolish. Yet they will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned and gave my heart up to despair concerning all the toils of my labor under the sun, because some things, what? Oh, sometimes one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all to be enjoyed by another who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. So when we think about, why do we learn? What is the point of learning and growing and developing ourselves? The writer of Ecclesiastes seems to be suggesting that there really isn't a point, because what's going to happen with all of that? Well, you're going to use it to improve the world, but then you're going to die someday. And when that happens, you're going to leave everything that you accomplished to somebody else. And who knows if that person is worthy of it or not? Maybe that person is an idiot or lazy and taking advantage of you and taking advantage of what you've accomplished. And so this person says, well, I guess there's just no point. It's all vanity. Now, of course, the writer of Ecclesiastes does not stop there. Eventually, they get around to the idea that, yeah, life seems kind of pointless sometimes because death is real, but God gives us meaning for our lives, and so that's where we find meaning. But I want to talk a little bit more specifically about how God is involved in our meaning making for our lives, and I want to do that um, by talking to you about. Nope, not that. What happened to my? Oh, so my category back there behind there says vocation and the meaning of life. Got covered up by my
Oh,
picture. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of vocation and how that helps us to understand um, kind of the purpose of learning and why we might care about learning and care about applying our learning. So I made this Venn diagram to show you some of the concepts that have to do with vocation. So you can see in the three big circles that are made of primary colors, we have these three aspects of life. At the top, we have our values. And as Christians, we wouldn't just call that values, we would call it faith. We would call it, our belief in God and our belief in God's law and God's grace and how that impacts our lives. Then the blue circle, we have our relationships. We have the people that we interact with. We have the roles that we take on in those relationships, that kind of thing. And then the yellow circle, we have industry, which doesn't mean like the auto industry or something like that. It means industriousness, our activities, our functions, not just our jobs, but all of the roles that we take on in life, not as identities, but as activities. So, the hobbies that we have, the jobs that we do or have done, the volunteer positions that we have, the choices that we make with what we do with our time, it all is wrapped up in industry. And then where these things overlap, you can see that each of the two overlap and have kind of a meaning to them. So when you combine what you're doing, your activity, with your values, that's where you find your passion. Why am I doing this thing? Because it connects to my values. Of course, not everything you do is necessarily going to connect with your values. Or it might be kind of more neutral or be harder to connect to your values. For example, today I had to go to the bank and deposit a check. Is that is that an example, a great example of my faith in God? Not necessarily, but it does actually still show my values to the world, at least a little bit, right? I mean, I'm not passionate about that check, but the fact that I took that money and I put it into the bank means that I value organization, I value saving, I value making sure that I know where my money is. I also value my community because I'm willing to trust those people who are working in the bank to keep my money safe electronically, so that I have access to it the next time I need to pay a bill. So that's where passion lies. When you go over and you look at the relationship between relationships and values, when you think about what do I believe, what's important to me, and my relationships to other people, and what their needs are, that's where mission is found. When I take what I believe and I apply it to the needs that I see in other people, in my relationships with them. And then finally, in between relationships and industry, we find profession. And again, profession doesn't just mean, your job as a professional. It means the tasks that you take on that aren't just for yourself, but are for, in relationship to others. Which can be your job. If we've got our dental hygienist here. Obviously, you can't have that profession without having relationships, because you have to have patience in order to practice your industry. So that's what I mean there, but not just the thing that you get paid for, certainly. So then in the middle, finally, after we kind of work our way in, we've got this concept of vocation. Vocation is often used in the secular world as a synonym for career, sometimes. And so that's probably, if you've heard that word before, that's probably where you've heard it. But within the church, vocation has a much deeper meaning than just your career. Vocation has to do with all of these things that you see in the rest of this Venn diagram. Vocation has to do with mission, what you feel you are called to do in response to the needs around you. Vocation has to do with passion, what you do that matches with your values. Vocation has to do with your profession, with how you understand your activities in the world to connect to the relationships that you have. And all of those things come together into this concept of vocation. And so the next thing I want to do is share with you a little bit about what my favorite theologian, Karl Barth, has to say about vocation. But before I do that, any questions about this diagram and kind of how we understand vocation in general? We good?
It's very clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. So moving on to think a little bit about what Karl Barth has to say about vocation. So Karl Barth is a systematic theologian, and in my Sunday forum, I've actually been teasing about systematic theologians, that what they have to say is not very important because they don't care about applying what they believe and what they think about and what they come up with. They just care about the abstract concepts of theology in general. But in reality, we need systematic theologians because we need them to think through all of these different categories of our faith and try to understand how they fit together. And so what Karl Barth did, Karl Barth was kind of at the height of his thing in the 1930s. So he's fairly recent in terms of, as far as theologians are concerned. But what he did was he wrote a series of books that are incredibly dense and, of course, in German. And he started publishing these. And his systematic theology takes all of these different categories. Who is God? Who is Jesus? How does Jesus save us on the cross? What is the Holy Spirit? What does sin, what is the nature of sin, and how does it affect us, and what does it do to the world? All of these different concepts, and he tries to figure out how they all fit together and talks about how they fit together and why they fit together in that way. And something that Karl Barth did that I was just completely taken by when I learned about him in seminary was that Karl Barth places his understanding of vocation within the larger context of his understanding of the reconciling work of God. And the reason for that is because Karl Barth says that our vocation is based on our election by God. Karl Barth is a Reformed thinker, and so he's going to talk about election. Lutherans don't really talk about election too much, but the concept that God has chosen us in some ways, elected us for particular identity, for particular tasks, according to some people, is very strong in the Reformed tradition. And so Barth wants to talk about what does that election mean and what does it look like. And he says that vocation is based on God's election of us to have a particular identity in Christ. And so Karl Barth is influenced by one of the early reformers, John Calvin, who has a very robust understanding of election, and not just election in general, but he actually has what he calls double predestination. He believes that some are elected for salvation and to follow God's call, and others are elected for damnation, to not follow God's call. Now, Karl Barth has a huge problem with this, because he says, yes, I believe in election, but I do not believe that the God that I know, the God that I've been spending thousands and thousands of pages talking about here, I do not believe that God would create someone or something just for the sake of it to be damned. That's not the God that I know. And so he says that in the act of creating something or someone, God in that action elects that person. We'll just use person as, as kind of what we're talking about here. So just by being created by God, every person is elected. Every person is chosen by God to be a person of God, to have a particular identity that God has given as a gift to that person. Now, that person has a choice. That person has freedom to respond to this gift. And so that person can choose whether or not they want to actually be that person. We have every ability as humans to say, well, I've only got one life and I don't want to use it to be this person that God wants me to be. I want to use it for what I want to do. And so I'm going to go off and I'm going to do what I want. We have every right to do that. But where we end up finding the deepest meaning for our lives, maybe not, happiness in the way that we Americans think is kind of the point of life, but in terms of satisfaction, in terms of fulfillment, in terms of feeling content with what we've been doing with this short amount of time that we have on this earth, if we strive to be the people that God created us to be, then that fulfills us. That gives us meaning. But then Karl Barth does have a sense of double predestination, but he kind of flips it on its head. Instead of having some people over here and some people over here, he says everyone is elected. Everyone is predestined. By being created, God chooses you to love you and to give you this identity as a gift. But then there's a second level to it. And he says some other people are called not just to exist and be God's people, but they are called also to a special task, to a special service to God, wherein they will experience the world and get to know God better and get to know themselves better by helping others to see God. And those are Christians for Barth. So when we are chosen twice, we are first called to be God's people, and then we are called to serve God's people in a particular way. So when we think about our vocation as people who are created to be a particular thing, to have a particular personality, to have particular skills, vocation is our response, and not just one response one day, but our everyday response with everything that we are and everything that we have been and everything that we will be to what God calls us to be and to who God made us to be. So we respond to our God-given identity. Do I want to live in the truth of who I am or not? We don't have a choice in who we are fundamentally at the core, because that God gives us that. But we do have the choice of whether we want to live that truth or not. And then vocation, as we move up to that kind of third tier, not only provides us with identity, but it also provides us with that purpose that we were talking about before. The teacher in Ecclesiastes finds living life to be in vain, because you're going to die and all your stuff's going to go off to some other person that may or may not be worthy of it. But when we live into the identity that God has given us by doing actions that respond to what God is calling us to be and do, we get to interact with our community, and we get a larger sense of connectedness to that community. We get a larger sense of connectedness to God, and we make unique contributions to God's kingdom in the world that only we can make, because we were created to be this person and nobody else ever has been or ever will be. And when I talk about this, I don't want you to think that what I mean is there's a specific task, that you were created to do a specific task in your life and that's it. This is a further reaching kind of concept. This is the idea that you are valuable to God as a unique creation in your very identity, in your very being, not because of one particular thing that you're meant to do someday along the way. Some Christian groups do believe that. They say, God created you for a reason, and that reason is, and then you can pinpoint the very moment, that happens. I don't like that, because, if I was created so that when I was 5 years old, I could have, given my mom a hug when she was going through her divorce and helped her face that difficult time in her life, and then that was my one thing, then what am I supposed to do with hopefully the next, 75 to 85 years of my life? My one purpose is fulfilled. That doesn't seem right. God, I don't think God creates us just to use us for one little thing and then say, okay, I'm done with you. God creates us and gives us identity, gives us purpose, and then allows us to work that out in the world, in our relationships with other people, and in the needs that we see, and in the skills and gifts that we develop, and in the relationships that we develop over the course of an entire lifetime. And so when we think about vocation from Karl Barth's perspective, we aren't just called to this identity and to this purpose, but we're actually called into a whole new understanding of how we fit into the world and what it is that we're doing here. When we respond to God's call, we gain knowledge of who we are, and God is revealed to us in the very living out of that vocation in the world. So it is by serving others, it is by interacting with the world and using the gifts that God gave us that we learn who God is, not just ourselves, but also God. And so it is through God's call and our response of obedience in our actions and our service, this is what formation is. This is how we as Christians are formed into our faith. So vocation is about forming ourselves. Vocation is about enacting and living out that identity as we understand it to be in that particular time and place. Identity or vocation is about receiving God's self, receiving new understanding of God. Vocation is about doing. Vocation is about being aware of the needs around us and serving the people in our lives and serving those relationships. So it's kind of this concept that encompasses everything. So you can see that, from a Christian perspective, vocation is much more than your career path. Vocation is about who you are, who God is, what the world is about, and how you're going to choose to follow your path and figure out what that looks like in action. So that was the heavy meat part of our class for today. Any questions or confusion there?
The election, so he is saying he did not agree with the two concepts that some people are elected simply because they're created, and some are for creation, and some are elected for damnation. He focused on the first, right?
Yeah. So Calvin said,
created.
So Calvin said there are two sides. Some people are elected for salvation. Some people are elected. Yeah, some people are elected for damnation. But Barth said no, everybody is elected for salvation. Because why would God create something that God knows is going to die, knows is going to be rejected from God forever? That's not the God that I know. In the very act of creating us, and now this is a different theologian saying this. This is Jürgen Moltmann. Moltmann says, in creation, God commits Jesus to his path. Because by creating something that is not God, God is committing already to the process of reconciling that relationship. By creating something that is other than God, there's already a relationship. And when there's a relationship, there's already distance, there's already space between them that needs to be repaired. And so if you think about God, in a concept kind of outside of time, we are stuck in our linear timeline, but God isn't. And so in that, in creating, God is already committed to not just creating this thing and loving this thing, but redeeming this thing. And so that's the first election. The second election for Bart, going back to Bart, is that some people are specially chosen from all of those chosen people to help the other people to see this, to understand something about God.
That's the sentence. Okay. Gotcha.
You good, Patty?
I'm good.
All right.
This particular session, I understand everything you've said so far, and I haven't found anything significant that I disagreed with, but I find my mind, I almost need to take a breath before you get to your next sentence to just run exactly what the last sentence said. And it's kind of heavy duty tonight.
Yeah, this was the core heavy stuff. So worry not, it'll get a little lighter now. All right, so now I want to kind of start to go back to the original question, because the question was not, what is my vocation? It wasn't, what is the meaning of life? It wasn't, why do we learn? It was, how do I apply what I learn in this class? So if we think about, why do we learn? It's because it contributes to our vocation. But then we can go back to that first question I asked, why do we want to apply our learning? Well, that too has something to do with our vocation. But I do want to differentiate these two concepts, because I think that there is a slight difference, especially when we're talking about Christianity. In certain Christian circles, the word application means a very specific thing. Typically, when I was growing up in one of these types of churches, you would have in your lesson, you would have the icebreaker where you kind of, get to know people a little bit and get people talking. And then you would have the study part, you would look at the Bible, and then you would have the application section. This is the time when we're going to take this information and we're going to figure out how this information can be applied directly to your life. And I don't think that I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with that, but what I want to say is I think it's lacking a little bit of the depth that vocation can offer. So I want to offer you kind of two different perspectives here. So application I see as information is prioritized. When you start with, let's find the information, let's read this Bible passage and figure out what it means, and then figure out how we take that meaning and we apply it to our life. We are taking the information and then we're taking the abstract interpretation of that information, just, on its face, what does this mean? And we are changing our behavior in light of the information. The information informs our behavior as much as we're able to. I mean, not always can we accommodate this. Some of the things in the Bible, it says, pretty clearly, but there are things that we can't do. Love your enemy. Well, I can't do that perfectly, obviously. But as much as you can, the idea with application is take this information, take this concept, take this abstract interpretation that we've come up with and apply it to your life. But I think in the abstract, there is a very limited set of possible interpretations and a very limited understanding of how you apply that. When you read, when you start with, I don't know, picking any random story out of the air. When you start with the story of Samson and you look at the book of the Bible and you read through the story of Samson and you get to the end where Samson, has his hubris has caused him to be captured and blinded and his hair chopped off so that he has no strength, and he's standing there tied to the columns, and he says to God, I repent, I know that I did the wrong thing here, but please just give me one last ounce of strength so that I can defeat my enemies. And God gives it to him, and he's able to pull the columns, and the whole place comes crashing down. If you start there and then you say, what does this mean? Just from a literary standpoint, that's interesting. I love doing that. We do that in here all the time. But then to take that information and have a one-to-one correlation between the interpretation that we just came up with in the abstract and how to apply it to your life, I feel like is doing a disservice to to the story, to the Bible itself, to our relationship with God, and with the revelation of God that exists within our scriptures, that God promises to give to us when we encounter God in the scriptures. Because I can say, in our lesson, we talk about, oh, well, the story of Samson is about hubris and about how we need to be humble before God and how we need to serve God and not ourselves, and things like that. So let's apply that to your life. Well, Patty, why don't you tell us in what ways you're being boastful and self-centered in your life right now, and then we can talk about how to fix that. I don't think that is necessarily the best way for us to engage with the Bible. I think if we take a more vocational perspective, then we can kind of turn it around a little bit. We can say, no, the information itself is not the center. The center is the goals. The center is, what am I trying to accomplish with this? With this, whatever it is, with this encounter with scripture, or with this encounter with another human, or with this encounter with God in prayer. We start with the goals, and then the information is one of the tools that we can use to address the questions that we are trying to answer as part of our lifelong journey of vocation. Questions like, who am I? How can I live out my identity in a particular situation that I'm dealing with, or just in my life in general? How does my understanding of who God is and what God is doing in the world inform my behavior in this particular situation, if I'm trying to figure out what to do in a particular situation? How can I take all of those pieces of that Venn diagram that I showed you? How can I take my actions and motivations and gifts and my values and my faith and my relationships with others and my relationships with God, and how can I synthesize all of those things into a collaborating idea that is not contradicted by the behavior that I am about to, take in relationship to this situation? And we ask that question to make sure that we are doing our vocation. We are leaning in to that identity that God has given us in our election, rather than pulling away from it. So, like I said, I don't think that the idea of trying to apply something to your life is bad. I just think that we have to figure out, kind of grammatically, what comes first. Am I taking the Bible and applying it to my life as kind of the secondary, as the object? Or am I taking my life and trying to apply it to God? And then I can use all of these things, including the Bible, including my prayer life, including my relationships and the conversations that I have, including what I learn in this class, and use that from my toolbox to figure out, what is really important in this particular situation. I got ahead of myself and didn't ask all my questions. So how does that strike everybody?
Who am I? Who is God? Consistent.
All right, so what I want to do with the rest of our time is I want to look at two examples of things that we have learned in this class previously. And it doesn't matter if you were at that particular session or not. But I want to take two of these examples and talk a little bit about this vocational model of applying it, rather than thinking about, you know, the application model that I expressed. So the first example that I want to go back to is pronouns for God. We had a class called "Is God Male?" And I'm not going to, you know, rehash everything that we talked about in that class, but it's important for us to, you know, to recognize that God is referred to as male throughout the entire Bible. Jesus even called him Father. This God for Jesus is Father. And of course, you know, we can talk about all the implications of that for people who have had bad relationships with their fathers and good relationships with their fathers and no relationships with their fathers. That can go on all day. We can also acknowledge that in the Bible, God is described like a mother hen. So not always is God just male. In some mysterious way, God has mother-like qualities. And I bring up this particular question because I got into a conversation with someone recently about this idea. This person has been using male language for God, male pronouns for God, you know, forever, and wanted to know why it's so important to me that we try not to do that. And I said, for me, it isn't about the pronouns themselves. I don't really care. You know, you can call God whatever you want. But what matters to me is, how does my language impact the reality that I'm shaping for myself, or the way that I perceive the reality? When we always refer to God as he, when we are lazy in our language and say, well, it doesn't really matter because God isn't male or female, and so let's just use he. That might be, you know, the conscious level of our interaction with this idea, but language affects people. Language matters. Language, even though we don't think so, the way that we talk about things affects our perception of it, and therefore affects our relationship to it, and therefore does it affect our reality. And so what I said to this person was, the Genesis chapter 1 says that male and female, he created them. In the image of God, he created them. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Well, if God is male, or if we always use male pronouns for God, male language for God, then what I know is that my gender is not in the image of God. A man can say that all of who he is, including his gender, is in the image of God, but I can't say that. And so no one that I know would ever say to me, I'm sure there are people out here who would say this to me, but no one that I know would ever say to my face, because you are female, you are not fully in the image of God. You are not fully human. You are not fully worthy of relationship with God and the benefits of that. But by always using male language for God, we are kind of creating the reality of God's maleness for ourselves in our subconscious. And when we do that, we are creating that reality that women are not fully in the image of God. Does that make sense? That it's not, you know, it's not what it actually is, but it's how we perceive it that creates it for ourselves.
Yes, that makes sense.
It makes sense, but boy, it sure is hard not to say he or him.
You
when you're
know, I
talking about God.
I thought so too, because I grew up saying he and him all the time.
I,
And what changed me on that was I went to a lecture, and it wasn't even about the gender of God or about language or anything like that. It was on like the Jewish interpretation of some passage in the Old Testament or something. I don't even remember what it was. But when the lecture was over, and it was during the question and answer part of the session, this visiting professor said, um, while there's a pause in the question asking, I just wanted to point out to all of you that I've been speaking to you for a good hour and a half, and I have never once called God he or him. And so I want to challenge those of you in the room that think it's too hard.
yeah.
I want to
Thank
challenge
you.
you to think about that and consider what you really believe about God, and whether you are just saying that it's too hard and dismissing your own abilities, or if you're just being lazy and think just using that as an excuse. And I was really taken aback by that. And so what I did was I started with my writing, which, was pretty easy to start with because I was in seminary. So I did a lot of writing about God, obviously. But whenever I would write, I would be really careful to avoid using he and him language. And at first it was really awkward and really hard. There would be times when I would be agonizing over a sentence, because especially when you get into things like, himself is such a hard word to avoid. And, you can avoid he, you can just, at the beginning of a sentence, you can just say God. But when you get to the himself stuff, in God's grace, God himself appears to us. That was the hardest part. And so people who start that tend to use this awkward, clunky phrase, God's self, God's self. But
Oh,
it's part of the process. I think it's something that you need to do. And over the course of time, I got pretty fluent in it. I got really good at writing sentences that did not refer to God with any pronouns, and didn't need to, because my grammar modified to change that. Just tonight, I wrote an entire sermon, and granted, I didn't write the entire thing out of the blue. I used several old sermons of mine and pulled some things from Bob's sermons and presentations that I've done and things. But I put the entire sermon together. It took me about 2.5 hours. And not once did I stop and say, oh, I don't want to use he. What can I use here instead? Because I've been doing it for 15 years now. And so it just kind of comes naturally to me. And so as I started getting better about the writing about God and not using the language, then I started to try to do it with my spoken language. And now today I can do an entire hour and a half class with all of you and talk to you, hopefully fairly fluently and without jerking around and stopping and trying to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. And it doesn't happen. And it's a process, I think just being aware of it, you can kind of stop yourself sometimes and then go in a different direction, and it trains your brain in the way that it forms sentences, that you don't end up in that, stuck in that little, rock and hard place in your language anymore. So it's possible to do. Lots of people do it all the time. I'm not telling you that it's super easy, but I think it's worth the effort because of this, because of how our language affects our reality. But getting back to our question, I think that looking at this from a vocational perspective rather than an application perspective, I didn't give you an actual Bible passage here, but when we look at the Bible and we say, okay, well, Jesus calls God Father, and so I should call God Father, and God is a man. But if we start with the goals, what are the goals? Well, my goal is to live into my vocation, which I believe is making sure that everyone feels included in God's kingdom. I grew up in a place where God was gatekeeped. There was a lot of gatekeeping around God. And so you had to be, you had to be a certain type of person. You had to be a member of a certain church. You had to be a certain age. You had to be a certain gender to, do certain things in the church. And that's not the God that I've grown to know. And so what's really valuable to me is making sure that anybody, no matter where they are in their life and who they are and how much understanding they have, they feel fully part of the community to the degree that they can be with the kind of personality that they have. And so if I start there, if I start with my vocation and those goals and those questions, who am I? What is my identity? What should I be doing in this situation? Then I can use those tools. I can say, hey, the Bible has something to say about this. It talks about Jesus's father, but it also talks about kind of God as a mother hen. And I can use my systematic theology as a tool. I can say, well, systematicians just say that, God is neither male nor female. And, it's just kind of a habit of people to use male language when they mean just something in general. And so I can use those things as tools, but I'm not focusing on the information. I'm focusing on the goal. I'm focusing on the situation that I'm trying to solve. So that's kind of an example of how you apply this vocational model rather than the application model. So any questions with that? All right. So one more example. I wanted to bring you an example from the Bible. So this is a fairly unknown passage from our Bible. It's a story that is not typically told. I don't know that it ever appears in the lectionary. I don't think it does. But this is a story about Moses and about his father-in-law Jethro. So if you remember from the story of Moses grew up in Egypt, and he found out that he was a Hebrew, and he got into a lot of trouble, and he ran away from home, and he ended up running into this guy Jethro and marrying his daughter. And so Moses has now married the daughter. He's left his wife and his children behind to go back to Egypt and follow God's call to lead the people out of Egypt into freedom. And they have escaped from Egypt, and now they are out in the wilderness and kind of trying to live this new life that God has established for them. So I'm going to start reading this story from Exodus chapter 18. And there are some ellipses in here because it's a longer story than I could fit on the screen, but the stuff that I am going to read that doesn't appear isn't as important to the story as the stuff that you can see on the screen. So here's the story. The next day, Moses sat as judge for the people while the people stood around him from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me and I decide between one person and another, and I make known to them the statutes and instructions of God." Moses' father-in-law said to him, what you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases before God, teach them the statutes and instructions, and make known to them the way they are to go and the things they are to do. You should also look for able men among all the people, men who fear God, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain. Set such men over them as officers, over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them sit as judges for the people at all times. Let them bring every important case to you, but let every minor case decide every minor case themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their home in peace. So this is not, like I said, a very commonly known story, but this is one of my favorite stories because, as we all know, I overdo it. And so this is a good reminder to me that I need to share the wealth because, as Jethro says, this is not good. What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you. So again, when we think about the vocational model, if Moses is using the application model, well, God wants me to help these people. God wants me to teach them. God wants them to learn these statutes and stuff. So who's going to teach them about this? Who's going to help them to apply it? Who's going to help them figure out how all of this information affects their lives? But Jethro says, Moses, you're doing this backwards. What is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish here? If we're trying to accomplish you as the center of everything and burning yourself out, that is exactly what you're doing. But if what we're trying to accomplish here is truly to form these people, then the best thing to do is form them into leaders so that they can help each other, so that you can create this structure of mutual support among all the people so that all of you can endure together, so that you can survive because you're not killing yourself working 24 hours a day to help everybody with everything, and so that the people themselves can grow and use their vocations in service to God too. And it doesn't say it in those words, but that's the lesson that we can get out of this. That when we are trying to figure out how to deal with a situation, we don't start with what information do we have. We start with what are our commitments? What is that we're trying to fundamentally ultimately do here? And how do we get there in a way that speaks to the integrity of our vocational process, both in terms of our personal identity, our community identity, and our relationship to God and our purpose that we find in that relationship. So how does that sit with everybody? Does that work?
Yeah, it does. But who decides who's trustworthy, hates dishonest gain? Officers of who decides who the righteous people are, I suppose.
That's always the question, isn't it?
Isn't it?
That's why the church has said it doesn't matter, because we do the best we can, but God uses who God's going to use, and
That's right.
the office is not sullied by the sinfulness of the people that hold the office.
Yes.
Sometimes we end up with that pastor that gets himself into some trouble, but that doesn't mean that the pastorate is a bad thing. That means that particular pastor needs to go and figure out his stuff before he tries to help other people with their stuff.
Yeah. And God always often calls, the least of them.
Absolutely.
That's where his heart is. And so there's a lot of comfort in that for me.
Especially because then we know that it's not us doing it, right? I certainly know it's not me doing it, because I am super introverted, never want to talk to people. But this is where I'm called and the gifts I'm given. And so here I am.
There you are. This is good. I had not heard about Jethro.
All right. So coming back around to our question. Look at me. We have 7 minutes left until 8:30.
Yeah.
So how might we apply what we learn in this class to our lives? Well, we need to talk about that toolbox. We need to put whatever we discuss in this class, whatever the question is. A lot of times, as you notice, like even with this class tonight, the question isn't the question. The question is an opportunity for us to explore something that is important in terms of helping us to build that toolbox. The question tonight was not what is vocation. The question was, how might I apply this? And so I had to say, okay, well, what is it we're trying to actually accomplish here? Is it to answer this question? No. I mean, some people want me to answer the questions and sometimes I won't. But really, it's about that formation, right? It's about that fulfillment of our vocations. And so what can I add to this to help us move in that direction? Building that toolbox is my goal. So keep your toolbox well stocked. Keep on adding to it. Keep on building it and cleaning it and whatever other weird toolbox metaphors you want to use. Make sure that we keep all those different elements of our vocation Venn diagram involved. Allow the conversations that we have in this class to shape your values. Compare them, take your values and compare them to what we talk about in the class. Think about how our conversations in the class might influence your relationships and your industry, your activities, the stuff that you do in your life, and how all of those things interplay. And then make sure that you're thinking carefully about how you can live that vocation in all of your decisions and interactions that you have. And of course, make sure that you keep those relationships open, because there are lots of friends out there that can help you, including the people in this class, to navigate difficult situations. And make sure that you're, again, with that vocational understanding. Vocation isn't just about me discovering myself, it's about me discovering God in the actions that I take. And so always be looking for that new understanding of who God is, that new revelation of God to us in all of our intentional decision making and interactions. But I think those are some of the things that we can use when we're trying to apply, so to speak, what we learn in this class. And so to leave you tonight, I wanted to bring to you from James. This is James chapter 2. Martin Luther hated the book of James. He wanted it to be cut from the Bible because it's about works. It's not about grace, he said. But I think he has a good point here. So I'm going to read to you chapter 2, verses 14 to 18. James says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill,' and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I, by my works, will show you my faith.'" So vocation is, to me, the word that kind of brings all of this together and summarizes all of this. What we're doing is we are living our faith by what we do, and we are doing our faith, building our faith by living it out. And so this interplay is, I think, what is essential. Not to start with information or to start with something that is outside of ourselves. Even faith itself as a concept that's outside of ourselves is not where we want to start, because we want to think about why. Why do we care about this? What kind of value does this have to what's important? And what is important? What are my core values? And the information itself is not the goal. As much as I love learning, the goal is, how can I use that information to support my vocation? Or at least ultimately, I hope that's what we're doing here. So that's all I have to say.
It reminds me, I had a professor in college who I had several classes, but probably 3 classes with him, and I'll never forget. It was health science degree. And every class he started, the first words out of his mouth were asking people what education means, or what to educate. And it is to draw out. To educate is to draw out. And that's what this reminds me of. It's not pouring information into your brain. It's drawing you out of what you're learning. It's drawing out. And so that's kind of has to do with our calling.
Yeah.
Our vocation is drawing out of us our gifts.
Yeah. That's good. I like that.
educato or whatever it is, the Latin or Greek, or I think it's Latin, to draw out. That just kept ringing in my head.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
And I like keeping your toolbox clean and well stocked and close at hand.
Yes.
Handy. It has to be handy.
Yes. Yes. And buy all the newest gadgets and put them in there.
Handy. I love it.
All right. Well, thank you, friends.
Thank you.
Next
you
week, we will be back with the question, what does it mean to be Jewish?
Good question.
It is a good question. We always have really good questions in this class.
Yeah, they're all good questions, but for different reasons and in different ways.
Yes.
Often.
Yes.
And one thing I would like to say in closing, Katie, and Jen, you're welcome to listen to it, but I know you said you had to go, so if you disappear, I won't be insulted.
Okay.
This class has affected me more today than probably anything I've attended to do with Bible, religion, faith, anything. And what it just, I don't even know how to explain it to you, but I'm going to have to play it over again several times and in a way that I can stop it so that I can really think, because there was just so much that was great and fascinating that I needed to stop and think about it right then. And yet the next great sentence was coming out through no fault of it was my mind. So thank you. It's been absolutely excellent.
And
Yes,
I really appreciate this mixed bag musings thing. You know, we've been doing this now for 2 years, and I see so many changes and clarifications in my own theology from this class, because every week we talk about a different type of aspect, and so it's polishing my toolbox, right? It's, every week I pick out something else, and so it's not, 20 years ago I studied this, and I got my screwdriver out and it was really good and polished and well oiled, but then I put it back in the box and then I don't use it again for 20 years. This class is forcing me to use all of my tools much more frequently, and that really helps me to tighten up my theology and have a better and more consistent understanding. And so I love this class. I really appreciate that we're continuing this and that the questions keep coming, because I'll do this forever.
Well, I'll forever if you'll do it forever.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
See you Sunday.
Yes. Take care.
Good luck, Katie, with all your presentations, and your sermon this week.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Send in prayers.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good week.